I'll be showing you the Sicilian in 10 minutes. You'll discover why this is my favorite opening against e4, which I've played for most of my lifetime, in fact. What's great about Sicilian is you immediately create an imbalance in the pawn structure, leading some quite interesting fighting positions. For example, if we take the main line of d6, d4, and really the main line of all the Sicilians, some would argue even the main line of all of 1e4 put all together, is the knight off Sicilian of a6. And what is it that makes the knight off so effective? Well, if you play to move e5 immediately, you're going to run into some tactical problems with bishop b5 and the knight often coming into the f5 square to attack our pawn. By playing to move a6, we avoid this bishop b5, so it means that if we develop to some quiet square, we can go e5 and, well, wherever the knight goes, we're going to have that equal foothold in the center. And we can just develop very naturally. White's plan in turn is to try to go for this sort of English attack where they castle long and just go for the pawn storm against our king for when it castles short. Which is why if you take the main trend at a high level, it's actually to play the move of h5 at some point. Which might look a little bit weird to move the rook's pawn, but if white doesn't have g4, they kind of have to figure out a completely different plan. And of course, we can't go into all the different variations, or the video would be way longer than 10 minutes. But this at least kind of gives a typical picture of what a mainline Sicilian looks like. We've got the imbalance of the bishop pair in the space versus black's more flexible position, and it makes for a very interesting battle. Of course, there are a lot of things white can play against Sicilian, against the knight off. We're not going to get to all of them. But another option that shows, well, what if they try to stop us playing the move e5 so easily? Well, that's where the flexibility of the knight off comes in, because a6 is also a very useful move when we go for this structure. We can often go for b5 and stuff like this if white were to develop in a very quiet fashion. There's no bad pawns, no bad pieces. And if they do try to take the fight to us, there are different options, but the most reliable one is the poison pawn knight off, where obviously you do have to know a lot of theory to make this work with black. But if you know that theory, you're basically not really going to ever lose. And if your opponent doesn't know the theory, well, maybe you can get some wins as well. So that's really the picture of the knight off. You'll also, of course, show some other ways to play it. Like, it's going to be a video the way, whether you're playing from white or black's point of view, you're going to have plenty of ideas to work with. So if you are enjoying the video, by the way, do make sure to hit that like button. For those who may be newer to the channel, go ahead and subscribe. And for the move knight c6, this obviously could arise from a 2 knight c6 move order, which we'll get to a bit later. But basically, it's a very flexible system. Probably, if there's one disadvantage of the classical, it's that if the opponent knows the move of bishop to g5 here, well, they're going to get a slightly better version of the bishop g5 lines of the knight off, because when the pawn was on a6, we had a bit more flexibility in the structure, whereas in this version, when the knight's already on c6, yeah, it does limit our options a little bit in some respects. It's, of course, still a fully playable position for black, but white does have some ideas to either sort of play in the center with supporting the e5 push, or, again, also the English attack plan with f3 and going g4, g5. Even though the bishop is kind of in the way, it can sort of tuck back, and it sort of ends up being not so bad for white also. But that's the story of the classical Sicilian, which, yeah, maybe doesn't have quite the same reputation as Knight Off, but still a very reliable system. Likewise with the Dragon, it's a system that, you just aim for is very harmonious development. You just make sure your king is well protected against a coming attack. And then you're going to say that you have some chance against their king for when they castle long. The move bishop c4 is known as the Yugoslav attack. It obviously has a lot of fury associated with it, with white trying to make the attack happen on black's king and black doing the same on the other side. But the move that you're going to see more often, and I think is more critical now, is actually the move of long castle. And the only disadvantage of delaying bishop c4 is that you do give d5 to hit in the center. But these arising positions after the exchanges and bishop d4 are certainly quite safe for white. White does, I think, have a small advantage in these positions, so it's kind of the reason why I don't see the dragon so much at a top level, but of course still a very playable opening that I've used myself with some success. And finally, it's worth pointing out that the pure Scheveningen with e6. If you want to play these e6 positions, I recommend probably playing with a6 or a Taimanov move order, that we'll see near the end of the video, because if white gets in g4, it's just going to be a bit too strong. Now after d4, c4, they do have various anti-Sicilians, like queen takes d4, and also bishop to b5 lines as well, which can lead to either some Royal Lopez style positions, or, some, in the case of d4, this kind of modified open Sicilian, where might end up going for a c4 Maroczy bind instead. But okay, we do also have some other Sicilians to get to. So after knight f3, knight c6, there's kind of a few different options for white, but d4 is, of course, going to be the main one, just going for the open Sicilian. After knight f6, knight c3, the sort of main line of knight c6 is the Sveshnikov Sicilian with e5, just wanting to get, again, that equal foothold in the center. And after d6, bishop g5, there's kind of the main line where white is going to try to use the d5 square as an outpost for the knight, which, in fact, he can even do immediately as such. But in return, black is going to get the bishop pair advantage and some prospects for counterplay. White's main plan, realizing that the knight on a3 is not so great, will be to play c3 and sort of bring that knight to c2 and try to go after our pawn in this way. Also, to move c4 is kind of a modified version of the plan to bring the knight to a better square. And there are some other plans well in the Sveshnikov, but that's really the main sort of battleground these days, is this battle between the outpost versus the bishop pair, which I played quite a lot as a junior with some success. Other systems tend to be not as popular within knight c6. The Accelerate Dragon does allow the Maroczy bind, which kind of gives white a very easy and comfortable development with the extra space. While the Kalashnikov is kind of like a sort of accelerated Sveshnikov, but it is true that it's probably a bit better version for white, when these moves haven't sort of been flicked in already, and because white can try to bring the knight around this way in some positions. And also even c4 again, the Maroczy bind also kind of becomes an option for white if black doesn't play knight f6. These days you'll also often see the Rossolimo with bishop to b5, which is, in some ways even more popular probably in the open Sicilian at the very top level, because you just have a lot of flexibility. You can either go for c3 and prepare the d4 break, you can play rook e1 and sort of try to push in the center with e5 sometimes, and you can also play it very positionally with bishop c6, where you kind of double black's pawns and say, either here in a more strategic position while trying to grind that small edge, or if bc6 is a bit more dynamic, where black will have some problems to fully catch up in development early in the game. And of course, e6 is similar choice for white, whether to develop or whether to double the pawns. So that's kind of the knight c6 lines, and then we can sort of have a quick look at the e6 lines as well, where again, like, there are various various anti-Sicilians that that white can try here to try to get a game, but d4 is obviously going to be the critical move in the open Sicilian style. And basically the main line for black here is the Taimanov Sicilian with knight c6 and queen c7, and kind of the attraction of Taimanov is to just have a lot of flexibility. Like, you can sort of decide, say if white goes for the English attack, you can decide whether to put the bishop on b4 or e7, or even maybe to delay the bishop's development in some cases. Though here the main line is to go bishop e7, and some fury has developed, but it's now thought that black is just fine, and because black is doing quite well with some of these accelerate queenside play approaches, it's why you'll often see players as white play moves like queen f3 or g4, trying to get sort of an improved version of an English attack as white. And of course there are other moves like bishop e2, bishop d3 that also have a lot of fury to them. So yeah, obviously there's some work to do for these lines, but that's sort of the different options at one's disposal. And of course on move 6 as well, there are moves like bishop e2 that are a bit more strategic, moves like g3 also more strategic, and a few more dynamic options like f4 and a few hours perhaps beyond the scope of this video. Also, if you play the Khan Sicilian, it's playable, but it is true that the lines where white kind of goes for the Maroczy bind either after first bishop d3 or with c4, they do tend to be a little bit better for white with best play, which is sort of why the main trend these days within e6 is actually the 4-knight Sicilian, with knight f6 and sort of playing these positions, where if they take on c6, it can get quite sharp, and you have this sort of battle between black's activity and white, just wanting to control the center and exploit that hole on d6. I realize, yeah, I probably didn't really leave enough time for the anti-Sicilians here, but just to very quickly mention the main options for white are either to. I mean, there is this bishop b5 system that sort of tries to play sort of an improved Grand Prix attack. Of course, there's a Grand Prix as well, and also the close Sicilian. And if you're looking for more like direct systems, there's also things like the Alpine Sicilian, which also can lead to some quite direct play, depending on also how black plays it. The Moro Gambit doesn't have the best reputation, but it is a system that exists as well. But against most of the alternatives, black can usually get quite good positions with fairly common sense play, like f4 as well went with d5. Bishop c4 tends to just leave the bishop kind of misplaced. And if they play quietly, just this dragon sort of approach just tends to work very well in general, with something like this to give one example. So yeah, that's my 10-minute review of the Sicilian. Well, we only barely got there, but hope that you enjoyed it. Leave a comment below what was your favorite variation from here, and I'll see you in the next video.